years ago, he was one of the first people that I met, and he was very interested in starting a Veterans Court in Williamson County. However, there was some current opposition at the time that has since changed, and so finally, I think sometime, hopefully this year, Williamson County is going to start their Veterans Court, and I'm really, really happy for you, Judge Wright, and you're the personification of perseverance. We had lunch with Kathy that day several years ago, and you were very determined that you were going to make it happen, and you certainly did, so hats off to you. I thought what I would do is kind of give you, the other thing I wanted to ask is, how many veterans do we have in the program? In the conference right now, just raise your hand, and how many of you have been deployed to combat zone or are in combat? So, wow, quite a few. So, thank all of you for your service. And we have some one of the reasons why I asked that question is because some of the things I'm going to talk about may hit kind of close to home to you. And I don't want to exploit the experience of combat vets, but I think it's important to be able to talk about some of the things that we see that combat vets have gone through so that people really understand the impact of being deployed to war has on individuals. So I hope that some of the things I say don't cross a line with you, and sometimes it may be necessary just to sort of like give yourself a pass if you want to take a walk out or whatever, that's fine. I'm not going to get too deep, but again, I think it's important to talk about some of the real life experiences because the Veterans Court really is about the individuals and about the impact. And so just having said that, I'm going to give a kind of a quick overview of the Veterans Court system in this country, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the things that we've done in Travis County, and I want to make sure that I share some experiences that we've had. I'd also like to introduce our caseworker, Jolene Graycheck, is here on the front row. Just stand up and talk to her. Yes, and Jolene she and I are pretty much I'm the administrator, she's the caseworker, we work hand in hand. And I was asked, I guess 3.5 years ago when there was a Veterans Court was being developed, if I would like to come over and start this program. And they asked me, well, are you a veteran by chance? And I said, no, I was a Boy Scout for about 3 years, but that's about the extent of it. But one of the things that I did do was back in the 90s, in between the Tarrant County history and the Travis County history, I had about 9 years where I lived in Washington, D.C., and I was working for the Social Services Division of the Superior Court, which is essentially their probation department with some expanded functions there. But anyway, it was started in 1989, which was the height of the crack cocaine epidemic and all of the issues that brought along with it. And so I had the opportunity to become licensed as a chemical dependency counselor. And after I did all my training, I had the opportunity to do my internship at Walter Reed Army Medical Center in Bethesda. I remember at the time thinking that I really had a lot of respect for they actually were active duty service members who were sent there because they'd had some sort of a substance abuse problem. And I thought, this is a great population to work with because I've been used to working with meth dealers in Texas and crack cocaine gangbangers in DC and pretty highly antisocial oriented individuals. But these veterans and these service members were really very, very different. And I thought, wow, what a great population to work with. I didn't know that 20 years later, I would have the opportunity to work with veterans, so it's been a real pleasure for me. So I want to give you, again, a really quick overview of the development. First of all, a couple of stats. I'm kind of preaching to the choir here because you guys all have some knowledge, but I think it's important to keep in mind the numbers that we're dealing with. 2.5 million deployed, 700,000 multiple deployments. Of course, we know that the more deployments, the greater your risk for PTSD or other mental health disorders. The U.S. has had over 50,000 casualties, traumatic brain injuries being the signature injury, and 4,500 U.S. servicemen and women have died in Iraq and Afghanistan. 1,000 of these deaths, so almost 3 in 10, have occurred as a result of non-hospital circumstances. So that essentially means that 3 in 10 have died either of accidents, suicide, or unfortunately friendly fire. death totals, I've done as much research, all I can say is 150,000. I don't think there's any way of really knowing, but obviously quite high. But these statistics will come into play a little bit later on in the presentation. I'm going to get just a little political, just very briefly here, because I think what happened, this is a famous sign that was written on a wall in Iraq, and I think it was early on in the war. And I think that this really is significant because when our experience, because what?
It says it all.
It says it all. Especially early on in the war, and here's my theory of what happened, is, 9/11 was a traumatic event for our nation, and I think that our country suffered PTSD collectively. And the only thing I can equate that with is a few of you may remember when Kennedy was assassinated. And I was 7 years old at the time, or about to turn 7 years old, and I remember it very distinctly. And I remember the pall that it cast over the nation and how just how sad it was. It was a very, very, very sad time. And then after 9/11, a similar thing happened. We developed symptoms like, anger. Everybody was really, really pissed off. And then there was a lot of anxiety. Prescription medications for anti-anxiety meds just went off the charts. But then something else happened, and I think that it's again, this is just my theory. I've not read this, but I think that in a sense, we kind of entered this phase where we kind of became emotionally detached, which is one of the symptoms of PTSD. And it's either coincidental or not that about the time that we went to war after 9/11 is when reality TV shows started, to appear on our almost every station, and it's just a mindless, numbing way to escape. And I don't say that judgmentally because I've watched my fair share as well. But there's something wrong when more people can tell you who Snooki is from Jersey Shore and can point to a map of Iraq or Afghanistan, which most people can't do. It seems like we kind of emotionally detached, and the fact that fewer, in fact, I think it's something like 0.7, 0.7% of the population served in Iraq and Afghanistan. So you have such a small percentage of our population serving. The other 99% were really pretty far removed from that. And I think that one of the things that we'll talk about a little bit later on is anger. And there are multiple sources of anger with combat vets that we see. And I think that in many ways, the feeling that America was not there with them during that time plays a part in that. So, having said that, I'm going to move on. History of Veterans Courts, real quickly. 2008, Judge Robert Russell began the first Veterans Court in Buffalo, New York. We're very honored to have him as the keynote speaker tomorrow morning. He's an amazing man. He is the godfather, deserves all the reverence we can muster. And then part of SAMHSA Game Center had a forum in Bethesda, Maryland. Essentially, that was one of the first time that people got together on a national level and decided, let's push for veterans courts. And interestingly, treatment courts have been around for a long time. Veterans courts is an offshoot of the drug court, which has been around since the 80s. So the question is, why did it take so long to get veterans courts going? In 2009, the 81st Texas legislature passed Senate Bill 1940, which essentially allowed counties to establish veterans courts here in Texas. And shortly thereafter, Judge Mark Carter, who I call the godfather of Texas veterans courts, and I guess Mary, that makes you the godmother, right? Mary Covington started the first veterans court in Harris County, then followed by Denton County. And then in 2010, most of the other major metropolitan areas began veterans courts, including those of us here in Travis County, as well as Fort Worth, El Paso, Dallas, San Antonio. And as of this year, there are currently, as I understand, there are 14 counties with veterans courts in operation, and 2 others who are scheduled to begin within the next few months. And one of them, Hays County. Diane, you said is the date the 23rd? 23rd will be the Hays County Veterans Court, which is basically the San Marcos region. So, again, You know, when we first started the court back in 2010, it's been 3.5 years, over 3.5 years, we didn't really know what to expect. There was kind of a push to start veterans courts, and so we kind of came up with this grant request and said, well, the first year we're going to get 25 vets, and after that we're going to get 40 vets. But there was really no way to really know how many that we would have. And fortunately, a couple of years before that, we had some concerned citizens in Travis County who began what's called the Veterans Intervention Project, or VIP. And it was started by a couple of constables, Maria Concholo, who's a constable in Precinct 4, and Bruce Elfont, who was at the time constable in Precinct 5. And they had the idea of starting a committee that would address how we can help veterans caught up in the criminal justice system. And a lot of this came from the fact that Maria Concholo's husband was a Vietnam vet, and he had gone through 40 years of PTSD, primarily untreated until a couple of years before that. And she saw the amazing transformation that getting into treatment helped him from Vietnam. And so she was sort of the impetus behind the VIP and took a leadership role in helping get the Veterans Court started in Travis County. And you know, oddly, we expected that there would be a lot of Vietnam vets who would be coming into our court, but we've actually only had two. We've had one graduate, and we've got one who's coming up here, who just started with us a couple of months ago. And that's 2 out of 141 vets, combat vets, that we've actually accepted into the program. But I think that when I look back personally on all the successful graduates that we've had, this particular Vietnam vet always brings a smile to my face. He's just an amazing man. And one of the systems that we have set up for getting people into the court is, and this was the intervention project had this done, was they did a jail survey to find out how many veterans come to the Travis County Jail each year. And so they took a 3-month period and they asked the sheriff's office, when you do your intake interview, would you ask everyone, have you ever served in any branch of the U.S. Armed Services? And if they said yes, then they just put that in the computer and was able to generate a list of everyone who had been arrested the day before. And so I get a printout every morning of vets who were arrested. What it didn't tell us was how many of these veterans have been deployed to combat zone, because that's one of the requirements of our court. But anyway, so what I do is I go through that list, and those who bonded out of jail, I look up their phone number, and I just call them and say, hey, this is who I am, this is who I work for, understand from my records here that you're an Army veteran. And I did that with this gentleman, who I'll just call Mr. B. So Mr. B said yes, he was in Vietnam, and I asked him if he was getting any help from the VA, kind of VA services. In fact, he was getting a lot of help. He did have a lot of disabilities. He had a heart condition. He had broken his back in Vietnam. He had his wrist was broken. He had a plate in it. He had some Agent Orange related issues that he had filed a claim for, and he was really kind of pretty not in great health. His arrest was for possession of marijuana and driving while intoxicated. And I asked him if he'd ever been diagnosed with any kind of combat stress issues, and he said, well, one of the doctors had diagnosed him a couple of years before with PTSD, but he never really kind of followed up with that in terms of getting any kind of treatment. And so I said, well, you might be a good candidate for the Veterans Court. And I started telling him, what we did and so forth, and he literally began to cry on the phone. And I heard him lean away from the phone and call out to his wife. She said, this man's trying to help me, this man's trying to help me. And it was very touching, because it was pretty clear to me that he had never really felt like he was cared for by anybody. And once I got to know him, I tell you, he was one of the most remarkable individuals you could ever meet. Highly intelligent, very politically aware. He has spiritual concepts, or he's obviously done a lot of soul searching, a lot of thinking. He's African American. He had a lot of problems in the military because he apparently was fairly outspoken, and it was back in the 60s and 70s when there was a lot of racism within the military and all that brought with it. So he not only had he experienced trauma in Vietnam, where he could name off Hamburger Hill and all the major battles. He was there broke his back in combat. He started suffering severe migraines. When he came back to the States, he went AWOL to get help because he wasn't getting any help. So he went AWOL. They got him. They actually sent him to Leavenworth for a few days, and then they brought him back and sent him. He volunteered, I guess, to go back to Vietnam for a second tour. But nevertheless, he did get an honorable discharge, and he had been drinking and smoking weed for 40 years on a daily basis, with a few periods of abstinence in there, but very few. And so he basically said, you know, I can do this, I can do this. I don't know, I know I can quit drinking, but I don't know if I can stop smoking weed. And so we said, well, you know, let's just take it one at a time. And it did take a while. We put the Scram device on him right up front, which is an ankle monitor, and he did. He stopped drinking, which I was really surprised because I thought this man's going to have to go into an inpatient treatment with Montessori, but he was able to stop drinking. We took a little longer, but we hung in there with him, and he graduated. And I remember that I was asked to write a story for a little county newsletter that we put out, and I thought, well, about the Veterans Court, and I thought I'm going to highlight Mr. B because he was really an inspirational story. I mean, literally, I'd spent hours just talking to him. He's this fascinating guy. He called me his brother of the Caucasian persuasion. But anyway, so I wrote this story about his life, and because I got to know a lot about him. He's really he's a whole mini-series in himself. So I wrote an article for the newsletter, and I thought, you know, this man's story needs to be told. So I contacted a reporter named Jeremy Schwartz, who writes a lot about veterans issues in Tarrant County, or in Travis County, rather. And I said, Jeremy, I think you need to do a story on Mr. B because he's an amazing individual. I think it'd be great to do a documentary film on his life. So nevertheless, I sent him the article that I wrote, and he said, hey, this sounds pretty interesting. So he said, you know, Veterans Day is coming up pretty soon, so I'd like to maybe contact him and do a story. And he did. It was on the front page of the Statesman a couple of years ago, had lots of photographs. It was a big story, and it was really very, very moving, and so we were really proud of him. So I asked him, I said, well, so how did you know, what are people saying? How's it working? And, you know, what do people think about it? Oh, everybody thought it was really good, and I've gotten a lot of people. Now, he was a very humble man, and one of the things that really affected him was the fact that he was shocked by the amount of respect that he got in the court and from us and from Judge Denton, because he'd never been in a position where he felt he respected him. Not that he was out looking for it, but it was just something that he wasn't used to. And so he was kind of embarrassed by this article. I mean, he was kind of proud, but he said, you know what, I didn't even read the article, but everybody's been telling me about it. I said, you didn't read the article? How did you not read the article? Because his attorney and the judge had it framed and you know, put a coin in the big frame, and it was a very, very cool article. So when it came time for him to graduate, he told me that day of graduation that he didn't read the article because he couldn't read. And I was really taken aback because I thought, how could somebody who's so intelligent and so philosophical and who's been through so much, how could you get by without reading? But he simply could not read. He brought tears to our eyes when he graduated. And those of you who've been to graduations know that they can be very emotional. But he was just one of the most humble men you could ever meet. And talk about Vietnam vets being long overdue. I mean, the way we treated Vietnam vets is a shameful stain on our history that we should never forget. And he really exemplified the fact that there were so many people who could have benefited from things like veterans courts that didn't get that opportunity. And I think that in many ways we owe Vietnam vets a debt because fortunately we learned about the effects of combat on soldiers and have kind of vowed not to repeat that same mistake. 200 veteran courts across the U.S. So I think when Travis County started ours, we were like number 49. So 75% of the courts have occurred just in the past 3 years or so. And again, there was a lot of oppositions to veterans courts. I wouldn't say a lot, but there was some significant opposition to veterans courts in the beginning, and I never quite understood that. It seemed like there were some people, and Judge Wright knows what I'm talking about, who just felt like it was the boutique court du jour, and that veterans didn't need any special treatment, and why should we treat veterans differently? And you know, my response is we've been treating people in the criminal justice system differently for a long time. We've had mental health courts and DWI courts, and of course, you know, drug courts and family courts and domestic violence courts, and mental health courts. And we have those because we know that if they're done properly, they're really effective in helping people and reducing recidivism and saving money. So it would just make natural sense that we would do the same thing for veterans, since we know that many of them have very high risk factors. But for some reason, people just fought that. And unfortunately, I think I hear very little opposition now. Maybe elections tend to get people's attention.
Well, I think you hit it on the nose a little bit earlier. During my dad's time, 15% World War II served in Vietnam. In my time, when I served, we 7%. And at this time, our stats show it's even less, 0.5%. So therefore, you have that group, if I can just be real funny, just doesn't give a shit.
Yeah.
Period, point blank. And it's what it comes down to. And you have many of your public officials. I represent Democratic veterans on the Democratic side. We were at the state legislature this past session arguing about getting veterans' educational issues passed to the children. And we had a knockdown, drag out fight. It's typical because most of these idiots have never served. That's the problem. I think once you serve, then you understand, you bring in your dead wounded. That's what we're talking in the very beginning. And you take care of your family. And that family is your veterans' family.
Yeah, and I think that, and thank you for the work that you do, by the way. But I think that a lot of times, you know, people, especially prosecutors or county or district attorneys' offices, believe that, I mean, they're so afraid of appearing to be soft on crime, when in actuality, if you have specialty courts that are proven to reduce recidivism and cost less, you know, you can lock somebody up and you can get a conviction on that person's record, and for the time that they're locked up, whether it's a couple of weeks or a couple of years, you have significantly reduced their risk to the community because they're incarcerated. But then they get out of jail and they're back in the community untreated with the same issues, sometimes even worse. And so in the long term, you're actually probably increasing risk as opposed to reducing risk. But I think that you know, we're evolving, and I think that with as veteran courts have proven themselves to be successful, there's again little opposition at this point, which I'm really happy to see. All right, so Veterans Courts requirement. Number one, now Senate Bill 1940 said essentially there are three things that you need to have. One is you have to be deployed to combat or other hazardous duty zone. And I know that there are some courts in Texas who take other vets, not just combat vets, but we follow the stipulations of the bill. We only take veterans who've been deployed. And we actually haven't had any recently, but we've had some people, you know, after the tsunami in Southeast Asia, there was a humanitarian mission, and we had a couple of Navy veterans who were on that mission, and of course, you know, tens of thousands of dead bodies and all that went with that, who actually had stress and trauma as a result of having served there. You have to have diagnosis of PTSD, traumatic brain injury, or other mental health condition related to their deployment. And of course, you know, for probably early on, like 3.5 years ago when we first started, most of the time when I contacted somebody, they had never been evaluated at the VA. And there was a reluctance to go and get evaluated. There's still a huge stigma attached, and so a lot of vets got out and they were just kind of dealing on their own. But I found that more recently, more and more people have taken the initiative or gone to get support services from the VA and already have a diagnosis. But what we'll do is if they haven't had one, then the next step is, if you were in combat, we'll get you hooked up, and we use our VJO to get an appointment for a psychiatric evaluation. And then the third thing is the offense must be connected with their diagnosis. And this is really very hard to prove because you can have PTSD. A lot of people with PTSD don't go out and get PWIs or don't go out and, you know, get into fights or whatever. So it's really difficult. But I think what the legislation was really aimed at doing is saying we're trying to help vets for whom we think otherwise they would not have been in this criminal justice system if it weren't for their combat stress issues. So real quick definition of trauma, experiencing or witnessing events that are threatening or dangerous and out of one's control. Trauma usually involves a feeling of helplessness. Bless you. Where there's trauma, there's drama. Have you ever heard that before? What do you think that means?
Shit hits the fan.
What's that?
Shit hits the fan.
Shit hits the fan, one way or another.
That's right.
Yeah.
You know, every combat vet, I don't care what they say, has some form of PTSD. If they've been in combat, they're in infantry, artillery, or tanker group, they're gonna come back with a set of fears and awkwardness about coming back into the general population. Plus, when you're in a combat zone and now 17 and a half hours later, you're stateside, that decompression is unbelievable as opposed to what it used to be.
Yeah, absolutely. So when you see statistics that say, well, 20% of combat vets have PTSD, you just have to kind of look and say, well, you know, maybe 20% have a diagnosis, but I don't know any of them who aren't affected in some way. Now, yeah, obviously there are different levels of you know, stress reaction. I really don't like the term PTSD. I know it's a clinical term, but I don't like the disorder part of it because, as I have on one slide up here, it's a normal reaction to abnormal circumstances, and I think it really prevents people from getting help. You have your finger up if you could say something.
Yeah, your stats cover, 25% of all of our homeless are vets. Do those stats cover this here?
Yeah.
Because most of the guys I talk to were living under a bridge. I mean, they're totally blown away
Right.
and disappeared from society and usually combat.
Right, exactly. And frequently from Vietnam. Right. So you're gonna, what this means is basically when there's trauma, it's gonna show itself in some way. And frequently that involves going to jail. So one of the things that we do, our county attorney, and I don't really agree with this because I don't think we should force vets to say, to talk necessarily about their combat experience and how they think it relates to this offense, because a lot of times they feel like they need to kind of spill their guts. And so what I always tell them, if the county attorney said, look, since this is what the law says, there's no way to know, we want them to make the argument. So we have a question on the application that just says, please explain how you think that your experience in the military contributed to the offense that you're here for. And so what I always tell people is, look, you know, this is part of the application, but do not feel the need to go into specific detail. You can be as general as you want to be. You know, we just want to, there just has to be sort of a nexus between the fact that you got arrested and your experience. And so I try to kind of coach them and give them permission not to be too elaborate in their details. And so most of them will write a page, sometimes a paragraph, but then we've seen some where people write 2 or 3 pages. But I wanted to share with you just a few of the statements that we got, so I help you understand what's going on with these guys. Began drinking heavily to deal with the day-to-day life in the combat zone. At the core, we all thought we were going to die. To come home crippled, drinking was a way to cope with that reality. I feel shame that I'm dealing with drinking problems and my friends are being shipped home in pieces. Coming back from Iraq and seeing what I did and doing things I did to survive was too much. I remember the looks of death and suffering of children over there. He says, I took a big step in asking the VA for help. I believe I'm a waste of time. That's pretty painful. Our father was constantly under attack, field dress, shot up and blown up soldiers, while they're still bleeding profusely. Just a matter of time before one of us would die. Lost a lot of good friends. I understand why God didn't take me also. And you know, when you look at these statements, there are a lot of themes there. You talk about, you know, feeling hopeless. You talk about feeling shame and the guilt. And you know, these guys are coming back and they've got all this stuff going on. You know, the one that really I think strikes me the most is, you know, this guy, one guy thought that he was a complete waste of time. It's like, yeah, I'll do what you want to do, but I'm too far gone. I really am beyond help. And you know, just to say, I don't understand why God didn't take me also. There's just a survivor's guilt that you often see that's just really, really difficult. And last one is I hate that I'm trying to justify myself and my abilities guilt. So this is just from the initial statements that we see vets come into our program. So most common symptoms, this is nothing new to you guys, sleep disturbances, everybody has problems sleeping, includes staying asleep and also having night terrors, anxiety. situations that are perceived as chaotic. A lot of times they're not even comfortable coming to court because the courtroom environment is foreign to them, and so you'll see people who always sit on the last bench there so they can be close to the exit and kind of be perceptive of everything that's going on. Hypervigilance, scanning the road for IEDs, bridges and buildings for snipers, buildings for exits, people who appear suspicious. Depression, feeling detached, hopeless, guilt, shame, and then anger, multiple sources. What do you think some of you, and I don't know if you want to share or not, but what do you think some of the sources of anger are with people who come back from employment? Anyone?
They truly feel nobody cares.
Those nobody cares.
And in my time, the VA, it would just be scrapped.
Yeah.
You couldn't get any services.
Right.
And so therefore, unless your family helped you, it was difficult. Plus, at that time in the Vietnam era, the public wanted you to disappear because the political war and then the war that you were having to fight were two different things.
Right.
So most of our people coming home were sort of like juxtaposition in a valley of shame, so to speak. And so you got really depressed. Really
Yes.
depressed. I remember my first job, I applied as a math teacher here in the San Antonio Independent School District, and I was asked by the superintendent, I was a combat officer, whether I was doing drugs because all Vietnam vets did drugs. I couldn't believe it. This was the perspective that they had.
Yeah, it was I'd say it was a pretty difficult and shameful time, back then. Other sources of anger?
A lot of the guys, I do a lot of help with guys that are in trouble, and I can walk into Walmart and spot somebody that is having problems with the outside world. And a lot of times, because of me wearing Vietnam veteran hat, they're willing to sit down and talk. And I find one of the biggest problems, guys come back from Afghanistan and start trying to tell their family. Because when you have problems, anybody in your life, you need to be able to talk them out, whether the person listening is even hearing you or not. But just talking it over and over helps you get it out of your system. And these guys are not able to do that.
Yeah.
Nobody wants to listen to them.
Right. Yes, sir.
Well, that gentleman had his hand up first.
Okay.
Is a protective response.
Yes.
You use your anger in common with that to overcome fear, to overcome anxiety, and it becomes habitual
Yes.
when you return to the civilian world or the stateside.
Thank you. Yes, sir.
And to add on what he's saying, is that it's also our survival. When our survival was, in order to actually make it through each day, we had to use that anger to survive.
Exactly.
And if we didn't use that anger and fear to over, then either we were gonna make a mistake, or someone was gonna end up getting injured.
Right. And it's hard to turn that off. Yes, sir. Gentlemen, yeah.
I was gonna add to what the gentleman at the other end of the table said. Coming back from a war zone like that, the only people who really do understand, and it took me a long time to figure it out, were older Vietnam veterans that, like you said, you can spot them a mile away at Walmart, HEB. So,
What is the signal? How do you pick up on that? What's being emitted there that you're able to say?
I have no clue.
Yeah.
If you're from Texas, you can spot another Texan in New York.
I hear you. I hear you. I understand.
How do you do that? I can't tell you.
I don't know what it is.
Go ahead, then.
This one?
Either way.
What I've noticed when you can spot a veteran that's either been to combat or not even been to combat is when gentlemen like you wear your hats. I'm in the military, I'm still in it, and when I see a veteran, I mean, I look at that, in their eyes, you get that short smile, but at the same time, I've never been to a combat zone, but I've had some buddies in my
Yes, ma'am.
I just finished my dissertation at Texas Tech, and I studied the visual problems that are associated with blast exposure. And so many times you hear people talk about the overlay with TBI and PTSD, but this post-trauma vision syndrome is also very similar. And without the person necessarily knowing, it creates a lot of frustration. And I think that is a huge source of anger.
Can you explain exactly what you're talking about, the vision?
Specifically, it's bioptic cooperation issues is what they call it. So a typical eye exam won't pick it up, and the VA estimates that at least 50,000 were discharged without being diagnosed. That number is very low because it's based on those who were diagnosed with TBI, and we know that many never sought care, even though they were close to a blast.
Sure.
They know that if you're within 50 foot of a blast, it can cause these kind of issues. And it causes visual processing issues that affects how you process your entire world. It affects your emotions, your moods. It can appear very much like PTSD. Typically, the people who have this, and it's very common, up to 80% of people who are exposed to blasts,
Whether you're unconscious or
they
not.
typically attribute that to PTSD or to a head injury. They typically do not realize it's visual. And the good news is it's very, very treatable.
Awesome.
One problem with that, a couple of people I've run into, the VA won't give you anything for it unless you've been in combat, been able to prove that you've been in combat. So it would be combat related, even though you went through the same thing someplace else.
Okay, we're gonna take a couple more comments. I really appreciate everybody being willing to share. I'm gonna take a couple more go ahead, sir, and then we'll move on.
Yeah, I'll give you a cause for anger that's never addressed, never spoken about, because it seems unpatriotic if you do so. If you come back and you realize that yourself and your companions were wasted
Right.
in political wars that served America no interest whatsoever. I can give it to the guys all the way up through the Second World War, maybe even Korea, police action. From Vietnam onwards, the government broke faith with its people and wasted them.
Right.
And you come back and you realize you have been wasted.
And that's something, again, that's a whole nother conference in and of itself, but I think you spoke for a lot of people right there.
Sir,
Real quick, sir, go ahead.
one last comment. The
Okay.
gentleman said he taught you how to cope before you went to the military or to combat zone with anger, and when you came back.
Right.
Well, I don't remember about before, but get this little box to answer your question. You put all that stuff in there, and you just push it down. That's who taught us on the way out at least, or when we come back. And then we go. So that's to answer his question back there.
Yes. And
Before, I don't recall who taught me, but while I was in the military serving tours, that was it.
you do a great job of training people to prepare for dealing with stuff in a combat situation, but we do a really bad job of teaching people how to reintegrate and what to do with all that stuff. But hopefully that's changing. All right. You're laughing at me, I understand. All right, just quickly, through the eyes of a veteran, Jolene found this somewhere on the internet. I thought it really did a good job of sort of helping people understand who were not deployed, what a combat vet feels. So somebody like me would look at the parking lot, we would just see that. And they may see that as well, but they're also looking at possible IEDs, roadblocks, choke point, possible sniper, over here. So when you look at the world through a filter that there's danger everywhere, and that's the way you live your life, that takes a lot of energy. That begins to wear you down. So it's no wonder that we see people turning to substances to try to, essentially what we're talking about is cooling their brains down. So in terms of what we see in the Veterans Court, Mental health disorders, most common obviously is PTSD, but probably only half of our cases, when you say doing are actual PTSD diagnoses. We have some that have a subclinical or subthreshold PTSD, but a lot of them are also adjustment disorders with anxiety or depression. So, and then everybody, almost everyone in our court, the 142 that we've taken in, I can only think of maybe one person who didn't have a substance abuse issue. Primarily alcohol use disorder, followed by marijuana use disorder, and then stimulant use disorder. And one of the things that I just tell people right up front is, hey, look, you know, I ask them, do you smoke weed? Because a lot of, you know, OIF vets smoke weed because they say it really helps them, it helps reduce their anxiety. And I just saw that there was actually a study that was being done that was federally funded about the use of marijuana with PTSD. But it's one of the things that you're going to run up against if you have Judge Wright, if you have a Veterans Court, you're going to find that some of these guys really rely on marijuana. They'd rather take marijuana than the prescription medication that the VA has given them. And so we just have to explain to them, look, we are required to test you. You're going to have to, and we really haven't had that much trouble. I've been surprised that we've had pretty good success in getting people to stop smoking weed. Now, whether that's a long-term thing or short-term, I don't really know. Okay, most common offenses. Far and away, most common is DWI. Alcohol is the panacea that takes care of all the ills, of course, followed by evading arrest. You'd think it would be possession of marijuana, but it's actually not true. What do you think the third thing is? We don't take domestic violence cases in our court, and the reason for that is that our judge happens to also be the judge for the domestic violence court, and he understands that one of the worst things you can do to a perpetrator of domestic violence is to reinforce him and kind of build up his self-esteem. You know, we do know that PTSD does breed domestic violence, but until there's a good assessment tool that will tell us whether or not they have a typical batterer's personality or set of dynamics versus PTSD, he's not willing to take those cases because he's afraid that that would further endanger the victim. So we have taken them, but it really has to be a very clear case where we're pretty sure that this was something that was totally out of character for the individual. But actually, it's not possession of marijuana, it's assault on a public servant. And as I said a few minutes ago, you know, you have a lot of combat vets, and typically when the assault takes place, it's because they're intoxicated and they're either being, pulled over for DWI, or maybe they're being confronted for public intoxication. And as soon as the vet finds himself in that situation, he's going to become very defensive. And of course, when his defenses go up and he may be belligerent because he's drunk, then it automatically causes the police officer to kind of respond in kind, and you have two guys going at it, and essentially the vet's going to jail. And so we see that time and time again. Unfortunately, the officers are usually, once they find out that this guy's a combat vet, he's got PTSD, they kind of go along with the prosecutors and say, you know what, we're okay with you dismissing this if they complete the program. But it's really interesting that, especially in Austin, actually all over the country, you see more and more cases of, police, and I don't want to step on your toes, but police sometimes going overboard, being overzealous. And I know one of the training workshops that's part of this conference has something to do with training law enforcement officers about PTSD. And I think that's really critical because they're going to come up against these guys, and if they don't know how to respond, they can either de-escalate the situation or they can escalate the situation. And I think it's really important that police officers learn how to deal with somebody who's been in combat, because we've seen time and time again that it just does not bode well.
I'll never hear of anybody smoking weed beating up a cop.
Exactly. Good point. Good point. Absolutely.
How about the case in Austin where you had the police doing a welfare check on the Marine,
Yes.
and they went looking for him, knocked on the door, no answer.
Yeah.
Then they went to the window, knocked on the window,
we first began, the county attorney's office did not let him in because of a number of factors. It's a lot more complicated case than meets the eye, but there are some definite questions about how the police responded to that. So, having said that, yes, sir, one more time.
Having been a police officer for 25 years and also having PTSD from my time in Vietnam, I confronted myself when I first came back. First thing is, when I came back from Vietnam, I'm in Vietnam one day, I'm back in the States the next, 5 days later, I'm a citizen again. Without, took me 6 years to find my way, and then I found my way into police work, and I was home. And so I learned somehow to deal with those people. And one of the things that I was taught by my sergeant was, when you deal with people, you treat them with dignity and respect, no matter what they've done, no matter what you think they've done. And fully realizing two things. One is that the person you're dealing with could be an angel sent by God to see how you're going to treat his angel today. Second thing is, you have to remember it could be a demon. And in most situations, and I know police officers catch a lot of bad rap, I've got 0.5 to 1 second to make a decision to shoot or not shoot.
It's a tough job.
It's a tough job.
It's a tough job. And interestingly, I've got a friend, I've got two neighbors, a husband and wife, and they both work for EPD. And I was talking to them a couple of weeks ago, and I said, about how many people on the force are actually combat vets? And he said, well, I can tell you this, probably half of the most recent training class of the recruits actually served in Iraq or Afghanistan. And I said, well, is there any kind of screening done, any kind of psychological screening done to see if they have PTSD? Because, well, I tend to agree with this gentleman that anyone who's been to combat is going to have something, some impact there. And he said, oh yeah, they do, psychological testing. And I said, well, I'm curious to know who's doing the testing and what they're doing with the results. Because a lot of times it really depends on self-report. And, as we know, people who are applying for a job aren't going to go in and report, yes, I have difficulty sleeping, or I have difficulty controlling my emotions, and so forth and so on. And he said, when I'm interviewing someone, he goes, I like the waiters. And I said, the waiters? He goes, yeah, I like waiters. And I said, you mean like restaurants? He said, yeah, those are the people who have waiter experience. They know about customer service. And one of the questions we'll ask them is, how do you handle it when you have somebody who's difficult, or somebody who's not satisfied? Well, waiters are, they learn how to de-escalate situations, kind of make nice. And he said, but this combat vet, I asked him that, and I said, how do you deal with somebody who's uncooperative? He said, well, I just stick a gun in their mouth. And I'm thinking it's probably not a good tactic to take if you're applying for the. But it makes me wonder how many people, because they want to go and continue the service. They want to do that. They want to do something that where they can get their adrenaline going again. Because let's face it, when you've been to war and you come back and life's kind of dull. But it really concerns me that maybe some of these folks are not really getting the help that they need before they're able to go into those situations. And again, being a police officer, you understand that it's a really difficult and stressful job, and I think that a lot of police officers have PTSD that go undiagnosed, especially those who work the night shift. Yes, sir.
When I went into police work, you dare not say you had PTSD or any kind of mental problem. You dare not.
Oh, of course not.
You work the next day.
You still don't. And then finally, possession of marijuana, followed by felony possession of controlled substances. Now, in Travis County, we have our judge as a misdemeanor judge. However, we take some felony cases. The district attorney's office has to approve those. And what we essentially do is we just have the conditions of their bond, their felony bond, are amended to include participation in the Veterans Court. They're taken off the felony docket list, kind of a little special holding pattern. And as long as they complete our program and do what they're supposed to do, then the DA will come back and say, all right, we're going to dismiss this case when they complete. So we're able to have both felony and misdemeanor cases.
Is Travis County the only one that has felony?
No. I know Harris County is primarily felony. Isn't that right, Mary? Yeah. Do you have any misdemeanors?
We have cases that are reduced to misdemeanors, but we don't take, or a felony district court judge, so
Right.
we don't have jurisdiction over misdemeanors.
Right. Okay.
We do misdemeanors and felonies and nuisances
Uh-huh.
and domestic violence and DWIs.
90%, that we do have a probation track. So in some cases, if the DA or the county attorney is not willing to dismiss the case, they'll give them probation and maybe give a little sweeter deal than ordinarily we would get and say that you're gonna have to do veterans court as a condition of probation, but 90% it's pre-plea, dismiss, you have the record expunged. You know what PTSD is? The bottom line is I just want to make sure that that you understand PTSD is a normal reaction to abnormal events. And you know, when I told them that I'm not a vet myself, I think that in some ways it's been kind of an asset for me because you know, one of the things that I do when I first contact people is I try to normalize what they're going through. They're already kind of defensive and a little bit hesitant to talk to somebody about, you know, their experiences or any kind of problems that they're having. But when I kind of I make the assumption that they do. And all I have to do is say, well, you know, how's your sleep? That's kind of my catch-all because as soon as I asked that, I said, you do remember what sleep is. That's when you kind of, close your eyes and they usually kind of laugh because they understand that, okay, this guy kind of knows a little bit because otherwise how would he know that I can't sleep at night? And then sometimes when they come in, I'll ask them, one of the things I really like to do is the old scale. On a scale of 1 to 10, where's your anxiety level right now? Because when they're coming into the court building and they're meeting me for the first time and they're not really sure what I'm about or what this veterans court's about, yeah, their anxiety, thank you, is very high. And so I try to get them to, it's so important. The first contact you have with somebody usually sets a tone for their interest level or their motivation. And so I try to help them understand that PTSD is it's just a normal reaction. And anyone who's been there, all right, I'm getting a signal that I've got 10 minutes. I'm not going to go into any detail because this is actually way above my intellectual pay grade, but I want you to pay attention to the temporal lobe because that's where the hippocampus is and the amygdala. And the hippocampus is a part of the brain that is it's where lasting memory takes place. And when there's damage to the hippocampus because of trauma, then it's very difficult for people to let go of old memories and replace them with new memories. And the amygdala is also part of the temporal lobe. It's part of the limbic system that signals to the prefrontal cortex, which is this part of the brain right here, that you're in a dangerous situation and you need to respond accordingly. So a simple way to kind of break this down is the emotional part of the brain is right here. So that's why the universal symbol, when somebody's acting crazy, we do this. Because literally that's part of the brain that's activated. And then the part of the brain that really helps govern behavior and make us think rationally and problem solve is the prefrontal cortex up here. And so with PTSD, what happens is the brain kind of gets hijacked. The amygdala takes control. All situations are responded to as though they're dangerous situations. It's hard to flip that switch off when you've been under a constant state of stress or in a constant state of danger for so long. So the reason why it's important is because in any kind of situation, it doesn't matter whether you're in court or whether you're trying to change behavior that, you're trying to quit smoking, trying to lose weight or whatever, changing any kind of deeply ingrained habit is very, very difficult because it really involves changing circuits within the brain. So, that doesn't happen easily, it doesn't always happen quickly. And the criminal justice system really expects people to, shape up and do so immediately or face consequences. And that's just the wrong approach because changing the way the brain functions it is not going to happen overnight. Okay, I'm going to skip some of this here because I'm running out of time. I do want to talk a little bit about childhood trauma because I think that one of the things that I've noticed is that a high percentage of the vets that come through our court also experience childhood trauma. And we know that a lot of these issues, can be caused by unstable or unsafe environment during childhood, separation from a parent, neglect, physical abuse, of course, sexual abuse, domestic violence, serious illnesses, or intrusive medical procedures. And having worked in the criminal justice system for 30 some odd years, I can tell you, if you work in the criminal justice system, you work in the trauma field. And it shouldn't have surprised me that so many of the combat vets that we see have trauma in their childhood. I would guess that probably maybe 1 out of 10 grew up in a home where both parents were married married or stayed married. There just seems to be a high percentage of family drama, abuse, neglect, divorce, domestic violence. And it kind of makes sense because, people want to join the military sometimes because they're looking for the stability, the structure, the family, the camaraderie, all of the things that maybe they missed during their childhood. And so the military provides that. It's a very nurturing environment in that sense. And then just being separated from the military brings its own set of trauma as well. Suddenly that support system is no longer there. And so if you had trauma where you got separated from a parent, or you had to move around a lot, and you lost friends, maybe siblings or step-siblings, it brings a lot of that up because trauma is essentially, it's cumulative. So the more trauma you have in your background, the way I kind of explain it, and this again is a theory, I'm not an expert, but I think it's like your trauma, your trauma immune system is compromised, so that if you take trauma with you into the military and then you experience trauma, which can happen just through training, you experience trauma in the military, then you're going to be more susceptible to it than maybe somebody who had a little bit more resilience because they weren't impacted as much. Let you read that. And the reason why I wanted to present that slide is because there's another type of trauma, and that is spiritual trauma. And I know that there was a workshop, I think it's on Wednesday, I believe, on moral injury caused by war, what we know and don't know. And I think that would be a great thing to go to because I've noticed that for people who are spiritual or grew up in a religious family, being in combat and having to do things and witness things can really shake you on a spiritual level. And the amazing thing about this guy here is, he, in addition to having 2 tours, he also grew up. His parents, he was from South Texas. His parents were migrant workers. His parents divorced when he was 3 years old. He lived with his mom. She did migrant work from California, Texas, Mississippi. So he constantly was moving. He went to schools. I guess they have special schools for migrants. So he never made friends because he always had to leave his friends. He grew up, he joined the military immediately, did 2 tours, came out of the military, worked his way through the University of Texas, got a degree in civil engineering, bought a house, got married, bought a house, and got a job, really, good paying job. This guy is the American success story, but he's one of the most somber, sad people we've seen, right? He's just got there's something there. He's very tough enough to crack, but he just does not believe that he's worthy. And this is something that I don't know it really gets dealt with in treatment. Frequently the symptoms of PTSD and maybe experiences are processed, but there's an even deeper trauma that occurs on a spiritual level, and I think that's something that's got to be dealt with. I've got about 2 minutes here. I'm going to skip over a lot of this stuff, and I want to end with on a positive role. The role of the judge, go back here, is extremely important. The way the judge interacts is it's kind of like the vets. The judge is the commanding officer, and the vets really want to perform for them. We're really lucky in Travis County. We've got a judge who is not only a veteran, he's also a West Point graduate. He's also an extremely compassionate individual, and he's one of these guys who you have to do a lot to screw up to get kicked out of our court because he believes no veteran left behind. And sometimes even when Jolene are like, Judge, it may be time to cut him loose, he's like, well, if he sees something in this guy, he's going to stick with him. And he's not here, so I will say he's almost always right. If he was here, I would say he's sometimes right. But he's really an awesome guy, and it's the role of the judge can't be understated. One of the guys that we brought into our program a couple of years ago, let me just skip to the stages of change. It illustrates how things take time to change. If you're working with vets who maybe in a slightly indirect way, you're not a therapist, there are a couple of things here that I just throw out here. I did a training for probation officers. The last thing is practice self-care, because it's really easy to develop what's called compassion fatigue. If you listen to trauma or you hear stories over and over again, your heart can only be broken so many times listening to stories before you start to kind of, become wounded yourself. So you got to take care of yourself. So the last story is we had a veteran who applied. He was studying pre-law. He wanted to go to law school at UT. Unfortunately, he didn't get in, but he did graduate. He got a job working with the Wounded Warriors Project. And he was originally from New York, and they offered him a position in New York City. So he thought, this is too good to pass up. So he went to work for the Wounded Warriors Project right after he graduated from the Veterans Court. And we heard from him last September or October, and he called and said that right before 9/11 last year, the Yankees and the Red Sox were playing in the playoffs. And he was called down onto the field because they were recognizing some veterans, and I guess because he worked for the Wounded Warriors Project, they called him down to the field with some other people. And he said, he had the entire stadium was standing there. People were standing and cheering and applauding, and he was looking up at the crowd, looking up the lights, and he said, all I could think of was a year ago, I was standing before Judge Denton in the Veterans Court, and thank God for that, because if it hadn't been for that, I wouldn't be here now. And so one of the things that I always tell people is that, it's our job to make sure that the day you got arrested was the best day of your life, because hopefully that's what got you